The blade was already pressed against my throat before the wedding chant even ended. I did not flinch. A queen of the Thracian throne does not flinch, not even when her own honor guard turns against her in the middle of a sacred ceremony. My name is Leora Vane, and on the day I was forced to marry a human, someone in my own court decided that day would also be the day I died. The hand holding the blade belonged to Vren, one of my most trusted royal guards. His eyes were glassy, distant, like something else was steering him from behind his own skull. The great hall had gone silent. Even the priest stopped chanting. Everyone in that golden chamber, hundreds of nobles and generals and foreign officials, watched the queen of an empire stand frozen with a knife at her neck, and not one of them moved to help me. Except him. Ethan Cole, the human I had been forced to marry as part of a peace treaty I never wanted, was standing beside me in a simple gray formal coat, looking almost bored by the entire ceremony until that very second. Then his hand moved. I did not see it move, not really. One moment Vren's blade was an inch from my skin, and the next moment Ethan's fingers were wrapped gently but firmly around Vren's wrist, holding the knife completely still, as if it had turned to stone in the guard's hand. Vren struggled. Vren was Thracian, bred and trained since childhood for combat, stronger than any human should have been able to resist. He struggled with everything he had, and Ethan did not even seem to notice the effort against him. He simply turned Vren's wrist a small amount, and the blade dropped from suddenly weak fingers, clattering against the marble floor. The hall gasped as one. I stared up at my new husband, my mind racing through 100 questions I could not yet ask. Guards rushed forward to seize Vren, whose eyes slowly cleared, confusion and horror spreading across his face, as if he had just woken from a nightmare he did not remember entering. Someone had controlled him. Someone in my court wanted me dead on my wedding day, and used my own guard to do it. But that was a mystery for later. In that moment, all I could think about was the human standing beside me, still holding my hand gently, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. "Are you hurt?" Ethan asked me, his voice low, meant only for me, as if a knife had not just been an inch from ending my rule and my life in the same breath. "No," I managed to say. "How did you do that?" He only smiled, that same easy, unreadable smile he had worn since the treaty delegation first brought him to my court 3 months earlier. "Good reflexes," he said, and nothing more. I did not believe him. Not for a second. Let me explain how I came to be standing at an altar beside a human in the first place. Because none of it made sense to me at the time, and some of it still does not make complete sense now. 6 years ago, my empire went to war with the humans of a planet called Earth. We believed, as every Thracian believed, that humans were a soft and short-lived species, barely worth conquering, let alone fearing. Our fleets were vast. Our warriors were bred for battle from birth. We expected the war to last a season, perhaps 2. It lasted 5 years, and we did not win it. We survived it. There is a difference, and every general in my court knew that difference intimately, even if none of them wanted to speak it aloud in front of me. When the war ended, it did not end with a human surrender, though that is what our histories were quietly rewritten to say. It ended with a treaty, one negotiated by human diplomats who spoke calmly, made no threats, and asked for remarkably little in return for laying down arms that could have continued the fight far longer than any of us wanted to admit. One of the terms of that treaty was a marriage, meant to bind our two peoples together and prevent future conflict. I was chosen to be the one who married the human envoy sent to my court. I expected weakness. Every report I received described humans as fragile, emotional, quick to tire, easy to control. I expected a soft-spoken diplomat who would serve as a symbol and nothing more, a decoration on my throne that I could quietly manage while running my empire exactly as I always had. Instead, 3 months before our wedding, a human named Ethan Cole arrived at my palace gates, walking calmly past a full honor guard meant to intimidate him, greeting my generals by name as though he already knew them, and smiling at me with an ease that unsettled me more than any show of strength could have. He never boasted. He never postured the way Thracian nobles postured, filling every room with threats and displays of dominance. He simply existed quietly beside me, attending court functions, asking thoughtful questions about my empire's history, and deflecting every question about his own past with a joke or a change of subject. My advisors mocked him behind closed doors. My generals called him decorative, a harmless human trophy meant to satisfy a treaty and nothing more. I let them believe it, because frankly, I believed it too, until 3 days before our wedding, when I received a report that troubled me more than I let anyone see. A patrol of my elite soldiers, sent to test the perimeter of the visiting human security detail as a routine precaution before the ceremony, had returned shaken and silent. Not injured, not defeated in any obvious way. Simply shaken, refusing to speak about what exactly happened during their brief encounter with Ethan's small personal guard, a single quiet man who rarely left Ethan's side and who I had assumed was nothing more than a formality. When I asked my soldiers directly what had happened, they would not meet my eyes. One of them, a captain who had served me faithfully for a decade, simply said, "Your Majesty, I would rather not remember it clearly." I dismissed it at the time as embarrassment, perhaps a training exercise gone wrong that they did not want to admit to. Looking back now, I understand it was the first sign of something far larger than I had allowed myself to consider. The wedding itself was meant to be a political formality, nothing more. A ceremony broadcast across both empires to prove that peace was holding, that the terrible war between our species was truly over. I stood at that altar prepared to endure a tedious ritual beside a husband I expected to quietly ignore for the rest of my reign. I did not expect an assassination attempt in the middle of my own sacred vows. I certainly did not expect my human husband to stop it with 2 fingers and a calm expression, as though catching a falling cup rather than saving my life. After the guards dragged Vren away for questioning, after the priests nervously resumed the ceremony as if nothing had happened, after I finally spoke the last of my vows in a voice that shook slightly despite my best efforts to control it, Ethan leaned close to me one final time. "We should talk," he said quietly, "somewhere private, after this is over." I agreed, mostly because I had 1,000 questions demanding answers, and partly because for the first time since this treaty had been forced upon me, I felt something other than resentment toward the man standing beside me. I felt curiosity. I felt, though I did not want to admit it even to myself, something close to gratitude. That night, in my private chambers, away from the eyes of court and the ears of advisors, I asked him directly, "Who are you really, Ethan Cole?" He sat across from me, still wearing that same calm expression, and for a moment I thought he would deflect again, the way he always did. Instead, he simply said, "Someone who was sent here to make sure this peace actually lasts." "That is not an answer," I said. "It is the only one I can give you tonight," he replied. "But I promise you this, Leora, whoever tried to hurt you today will not succeed, not while I am here." I studied his face for a long moment, searching for the softness I had been told to expect from his species, the fragility every report insisted was universal among humans. I found none of it. I found something calm and immovable instead, something that unsettled me far more than open hostility ever could have. I did not sleep well that night, not out of fear, though fear was certainly present, curling quietly beneath my ribs. I lay awake because for the first time since this arranged marriage had been announced, I found myself wondering not how quickly I could ignore my new husband, but what exactly he was hiding, and why my instincts told me the answer would change everything I thought I understood about the war we had barely survived. Somewhere in my palace, guards were questioning Vren, trying to determine who had controlled his mind long enough to turn him against me. Somewhere beyond my palace walls, a rival queen named Sareth was already receiving whispered reports about the incident at my wedding, calculating how she might use it against me. And somewhere close beside me, sleeping in the chamber adjoining mine with the same calm ease he carried into every room, was a human who had stopped an assassin without breaking a sweat, and who I was beginning to suspect was far more than the treaty documents had ever described. I did not know it yet, but I had just married the single most dangerous being I would ever encounter in my entire reign, and somehow, impossibly, he was on my side. The following morning, my chief advisor, an aging Thracian named Kessa, who had served 3 monarchs before me, arrived at my chambers before I had even finished dressing, her expression tight with barely controlled alarm. "Your Majesty," she said, "the investigation into Vren has produced nothing. He remembers walking to the ceremony. He remembers standing guard. He does not remember drawing his blade at all. It is as though several minutes were simply erased from his mind." "Mind control?" I said, though the word tasted strange even as I spoke it. Such abilities existed among certain rare Thracian bloodlines, though they were forbidden by ancient law and considered a relic of a darker, more brutal era of our history. Someone with the old gift did this. "So it would seem," Kessa said carefully, "which narrows our suspects considerably, Your Majesty. There are perhaps a dozen noble houses left who still carry that bloodline, hidden and unused for generations." I already had a guess forming in my mind, though I did not speak it aloud yet. Sereth, queen of a neighboring hive, and my oldest political rival, came from one of the few remaining bloodlines rumored to still possess that forbidden gift, though she had always publicly denied it. She had opposed this treaty from its very first draft, arguing loudly in council that marrying a queen to a human was an insult to every Thracian who had died in the war. If anyone stood to benefit from my death on my own wedding day, framed as an unfortunate accident rather than an act of murder, it was her. But I had no proof. Not yet. And a queen who accuses a rival without evidence only weakens her own position further. I spent the following days observing Ethan more carefully than I had allowed myself to before. I told myself it was simple caution, the natural wariness any ruler should feel toward an unknown variable now permanently attached to her throne. In truth, curiosity had taken firm root in me, and I found myself watching him the way a scholar watches an unsolved puzzle. He rose early each morning and walked the palace gardens alone, moving with an unhurried grace that seemed almost deliberate, as though he were constantly holding something back. He was unfailingly polite to every servant and guard he encountered, remembering names after hearing them only once, a small detail that endeared him to my staff far more quickly than any noble-born human diplomat before him ever had. He asked thoughtful questions during council sessions, questions that revealed a surprisingly deep understanding of Thracian politics, our history, our old wars, even our ancient forbidden bloodlines, though he never explained where such knowledge had come from. And every single evening, without fail, his personal guard, a quiet man named Daniel Hart who rarely spoke and seemed to exist purely to remain near Ethan's side, would disappear for exactly 1 hour before returning without explanation. I finally asked Ethan about it directly, 3 weeks after our wedding, as we shared a quiet evening meal in my private dining chamber, one of the few places in my palace where I did not feel constantly watched by court and council alike. "Where does Daniel go every evening?" I asked, watching his face closely for any flicker of hesitation. "He checks the perimeter," Ethan said simply. "Old habit. He does not trust anyone else to do it properly." "Your perimeter is guarded by my own royal soldiers," I pointed out. "Some of the finest warriors in my empire." "I know," Ethan said, and something in his tone told me this was not meant as an insult to my soldiers, merely a statement of fact from a man who measured security by an entirely different standard than the one I was used to. "He still checks." I let the matter drop that evening, though it lingered in my thoughts long afterward. There was a pattern forming around my new husband that I could not quite name, pieces of a puzzle that refused to connect no matter how I turned them. The true turning point came nearly a month into our marriage, during a diplomatic gathering held to celebrate what the treaty called the first anniversary of lasting peace between our two peoples. Representatives from 3 neighboring hives attended, including, much to my private dismay, Queen Sereth herself, resplendent in ceremonial black and silver, her sharp eyes finding mine across the crowded hall the moment she arrived. She approached me directly within the first hour, her voice honey-smooth in the way that only the most dangerous court players ever managed. "Congratulations, Leora, on your continued survival," she said, her gaze flicking briefly toward Ethan, who stood a respectful distance away, speaking quietly with a group of visiting officials. "I understand your wedding day was rather more eventful than anyone anticipated." "Accidents happen," I replied evenly, refusing to give her the reaction she was clearly hunting for. "Do they?" Sareth's smile did not reach her eyes. "I have heard the strangest rumor, that your husband stopped an armed and trained soldier using nothing but his bare hand. Humans are known for many things, Leora. Physical strength has never been one of them. You seem very interested in my husband," I said carefully. "I am interested in the truth," Sareth replied, "and I do not believe the truth is being told to this court. A treaty built on hidden lies is not peace, Leora. It is merely a war paused, waiting to resume the moment the lies collapse." She left before I could respond, gliding away through the crowd to speak with other guests, leaving me standing alone with a chill settling deep into my chest, despite the warmth of the crowded hall around me. I found Ethan later that same evening, standing alone on a private balcony overlooking the palace gardens, the twin moons of my world casting pale silver light across his face. "Sareth suspects you are hiding something," I said, joining him at the railing. "She is right," Ethan said, without turning to look at me. My breath caught somewhere in my chest. "Then tell me what it is, Ethan. I am your wife. I am the queen you are supposedly protecting. I deserve to know what exactly I have married." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I began to think he would deflect once again, the way he always had before. Then he turned to face me fully, and something in his expression had shifted, the easy calm replaced by something more careful, more deliberate. "During the war," he said slowly, "your fleets believed they were fighting the full strength of humanity. They were not. Earth held back nearly everything it truly had, Leora, not out of weakness, out of restraint, out of the hope that the war could end before it became something neither side could ever recover from." I felt something cold settle into my stomach. "Restraint," I repeated. "You are telling me humanity could have fought harder." "I am telling you humanity could have ended the war in weeks, not years," Ethan said quietly, "and chose not to." "Why?" I demanded, my voice tighter than I intended. "Why would any species show restraint against an enemy trying to destroy them?" "Because ending a war through total destruction only creates a new war later," Ethan said. "We wanted peace that would actually last, not a peace built on the ashes of an enemy who would spend the next century planning revenge. So the diplomats offered you a treaty far more generous than your empire had any right to expect after everything that happened, and a few of us were sent along with that treaty, quietly, to make certain it held." "A few of you," I echoed, "meaning you are not the only one." "There are others," Ethan confirmed, "scattered among the treaty delegations sent to every hive that fought in the war. Most of them will never need to reveal what they truly are. I had hoped I would be one of them." "And now?" His jaw tightened slightly. "Now someone in your own court used a forbidden gift to try to kill you on our wedding day, and I am no longer certain quiet restraint is enough to keep this peace standing. Sareth is testing the boundaries, Leora. She is testing how far she can push before something breaks. And I need you to trust me when I tell you, whatever comes next, I did not marry you simply because a treaty demanded it." I stared at him, searching his face for the deception I had been trained since birth to expect from every ally, every rival, every stranger who ever stood close enough to threaten my throne. I found none. I found only quiet, steady certainty, the same certainty I had seen in the exact moment he stopped a blade meant for my throat without so much as raising his voice. "What exactly are you, Ethan Cole?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked out over the moonlit gardens for a long moment before answering. "Someone your empire is very fortunate never had to fight at full strength," he said finally, "and someone who is about to become very difficult to hide if Sareth continues pushing the way she has been." Neither of us spoke again for several long minutes, the silence between us filled with 1,000 unspoken questions I did not yet have the courage to ask, and a growing certainty settling deep in my chest that the peace my empire had fought so hard to secure was standing on far thinner ground than any of us had been allowed to realize. 3 days later, Sereth formally challenged the legitimacy of my marriage before the full assembled council, demanding a trial that would force Ethan to reveal, once and for all, exactly what he truly was. I did not know yet that I was about to watch my husband become something no one in my empire, myself included, would ever be prepared to witness. The council chamber had never felt so crowded, nor so silent, as it did the morning Sereth stood before the assembled nobles of 3 hives and formally demanded her trial. A queen married beneath her station brings shame upon every crown that recognizes her rule, Sereth declared, her voice carrying easily through the vast stone chamber, every word aimed directly at me, though her eyes never left the crowd she was so carefully performing for. I do not ask this lightly. I ask it because the peace we were promised was built upon a treaty none of us were permitted to fully examine, and a husband none of us were permitted to fully question. I demand the ancient right of trial. Let the human prove, before all assembled witnesses, that he is worthy of the throne he now shares. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, some nobles nodding in quiet agreement, others glancing nervously toward me, waiting to see how I would respond. The trial of standing was an old custom, rarely invoked in recent generations, a formal combat ritual meant to test whether a consort was truly fit to stand beside a ruling queen. It was not meant to be fatal. It was meant to be humiliating, a public demonstration of weakness designed to strip away whatever legitimacy the losing party still clung to. Against a trained Thracian warrior, no human should have stood a chance. I rose from my seat, my mind racing through every possible argument I could offer to refuse this challenge without appearing weak myself. The trial of standing has not been invoked in over a century, I said carefully. Its rules were designed for combat between Thracian nobles of comparable strength, not between species with entirely different physical capabilities. This is not a fair test, Sereth. It is a public execution disguised as tradition. Then let your husband decline, Sereth said smoothly, and let the entire empire understand exactly why he cannot accept. The trap closed around me perfectly, exactly as she had designed it. If I refused on Ethan's behalf, I confirmed every rumor already circling the court, that my human husband was weak, unworthy, a diplomatic decoration incapable of standing on his own. If I allowed the trial to proceed, I risked watching him seriously injured or worse, in front of every noble whose support I still desperately needed to maintain my rule. I turned to look at Ethan, seated quietly beside me throughout the entire confrontation, his expression unreadable in the way I had slowly learned meant he was thinking several steps ahead of everyone else in the room. I accept the trial, he said simply, before I could speak a single word on his behalf. The chamber erupted into startled whispers. I gripped his arm beneath the table, out of view of the watching council. Ethan, you do not understand what you are agreeing to. Her champion will be one of the strongest warriors in her hive. This is not a formality. People have died in this ritual before, regardless of what the ancient rules claim. He turned to look at me, and for the first time since our wedding, I saw something almost like reassurance in his expression, quiet and absolute. Trust me, Leora, he said softly, echoing the words he had spoken to me on our very first night as husband and wife. I told you I would keep this peace standing. This is simply part of keeping that promise. I wanted to argue further. I wanted to forbid the trial entirely and accept whatever political damage came from doing so. But something in his eyes stopped me, some quiet certainty I could not fully explain even to myself, and against every instinct my training as a ruler had ever taught me, I nodded my agreement instead. 3 days, Sereth announced with clear satisfaction, rising from her seat with the confident grace of someone who believed she had already won. My champion will be Marcus Hale, victor of the last 7 trials held across the northern hives. Let us see if the human survives even the opening exchange. The 3 days that followed were among the longest of my entire reign. My generals urged me privately to find any excuse to cancel the trial, warning me that Marcus Hale was not simply strong, but genuinely lethal, a warrior who had killed 2 opponents in previous trials despite the ritual's supposed non-fatal rules, walking away each time with only a symbolic reprimand from his queen. Kessa, my oldest advisor, came to me the night before the trial with tears in her eyes, begging me to reconsider. "Your Majesty, I have served this throne for 3 monarchs," she said, her voice trembling. "I have never seen a human survive combat against a trained Thracian warrior, let alone one as skilled as Marcus Hale. Please, reconsider this before it is too late." I wanted to agree with her. Every instinct I possessed screamed that I was about to watch my husband, whatever else he truly was beneath his calm exterior, walk into a fight he could not possibly win. And yet Ethan remained utterly calm throughout those 3 days, continuing his morning walks through the gardens, as though nothing unusual awaited him, sharing quiet meals with me each evening, without a single flicker of fear crossing his expression. On the final night before the trial, I found him standing once again on the same private balcony where he had first told me the truth about humanity's restraint during the war. "Are you afraid?" I asked him quietly, joining him at the railing. "No," he said simply. "Should I be?" He considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Cesareth should be," he said finally, "not you." I did not fully understand what he meant until the following afternoon, when the entire court gathered in the great combat arena beneath my palace, thousands of nobles and citizens filling the stone seats to witness what nearly everyone assumed would be a swift and humiliating end to the treaty marriage that had been forced upon our 2 peoples. Marcus Hale entered the arena first, massive even by Thracian standards, his body marked with the ceremonial scars of 7 previous victories, his presence alone causing a wave of nervous silence to ripple across the watching crowd. He carried no weapon, as tradition demanded, relying instead on the natural strength and speed bred into his warrior bloodline across countless generations. Ethan entered a moment later, wearing simple training clothes, his expression as calm and unbothered as it had been every single day since I first met him. The contrast between the 2 men could not have been more stark, and I heard Sereth's quiet laugh drift across the arena from her seat among the visiting dignitaries. "This will be over quickly," she said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. The ceremonial horn sounded, and the trial began. Marcus Hale moved first, closing the distance between them with the terrifying speed I had watched Thracian warriors display in countless training exercises across my reign. Any Thracian noble would have needed every ounce of trained reflex simply to track that opening movement, let alone respond to it. Ethan did not seem to hurry at all, and yet somehow, impossibly, he was simply no longer where Marcus Hale's strike landed. He had moved perhaps half a step to the side, an adjustment so small it seemed almost lazy, and Marcus Hale's powerful blow struck nothing but empty air where my husband had stood only a heartbeat before. The crowd fell silent. Marcus Hale recovered quickly, turning to press his attack again, faster this time, more aggressive, clearly startled by the unexpected miss. Again, Ethan simply was not there when the strike arrived, moving with an ease that made the Thracian warrior's considerable speed look almost sluggish by comparison. I gripped the edge of my throne, my heart pounding as I watched what should have been an impossible mismatch unfold into something else entirely. Around me, the assembled court had gone utterly silent, thousands of nobles and citizens watching with the same stunned disbelief that had gripped me since the moment Ethan stopped an assassin's blade with 2 fingers on our wedding day. Marcus Hale attacked a 3rd time, and a 4th, each strike faster and more desperate than the last, his confidence visibly cracking as every single attempt failed to connect with a target that seemed to simply know exactly where to be a fraction of a second before the strike arrived. Ethan had not thrown a single blow of his own. He had not needed to. He was simply, effortlessly, always exactly where the danger was not. "Fight back," Cesareth called out from her seat, her earlier confidence replaced by something sharper, more anxious. "Stop toying with him and fight back properly." Ethan finally responded, though not with the violence the crowd had gathered to witness. As Marcus Hale lunged forward one final time, overextending in his frustration, Ethan simply caught his outstretched arm, redirected the massive warrior's own momentum against him, and guided him gently but firmly to the ground, holding him there without applying any force beyond what was necessary to keep him still. The arena fell into absolute silence. Marcus Hale struggled briefly against the hold, and quickly stopped, his expression shifting from fury to something closer to shock as he realized, perhaps for the first time in his long career of undefeated trials, that he had encountered an opponent whose strength he could not even begin to measure. "Yield," Ethan said quietly, his voice calm and clear enough to carry across the entire silent arena. "This does not need to go any further." Marcus Hale, victor of 7 previous trials, warrior of a bloodline bred across generations for exactly this kind of combat, simply nodded his surrender, unable to find words for what had just happened to him. Ethan released him immediately, stepping back and offering his hand to help the fallen champion to his feet, a gesture of respect that seemed to unsettle the watching crowd even more than the fight itself had. Marcus Hale hesitated, then accepted the offered hand, rising slowly, his eyes fixed on Ethan with an expression I recognized immediately, having worn something close to it myself since the very beginning of this marriage. Awe. I looked across the arena to where Sarith sat frozen in her seat, her carefully constructed plan collapsing in real time before an audience of thousands, and understood immediately that whatever quiet restraint Ethan had shown throughout our entire marriage so far had just been permanently and irreversibly broken in front of the one audience that mattered most. The Empire had just witnessed something it could never unsee, and I, standing at the center of it all, finally understood that I had not married a diplomat, nor a decoration, nor even simply a husband. I had married something my entire species had been extraordinarily fortunate never to face at full strength during the war we barely survived. And now, for better or for worse, the entire court had seen exactly enough to begin asking questions that would change everything about the peace we had all been so desperately trying to protect. The silence in the arena stretched long after Marcus Hale rose to his feet, until finally Sarith stood from her seat, her composure visibly cracking for the first time since I had known her. "This was a trick," she announced, her voice carrying across the stunned crowd, though it lacked the confident authority it had held only minutes earlier. "Some human device, some hidden technology used to cheat the trial. I demand an inspection." "Inspect me however you wish," Ethan said calmly, still standing at the center of the arena, showing no sign of exertion despite what the crowd had just witnessed. "You will find nothing but the body I was born with." The inspection, Sarith demanded, took place that same afternoon, conducted by a panel of neutral physicians drawn from a hive that had remained uninvolved in our political rivalry. They found exactly what Ethan had promised they would find, nothing at all beyond an unusually fit and healthy human body, with no hidden devices, no forbidden enhancements, no explanation whatsoever for what the entire arena had witnessed. I met with Ethan privately that same evening, in my chambers, away from the whispers and speculation already spreading like wildfire throughout every corner of my palace. "You held back," I said, once the door had closed behind us. "During the entire trial, you never once used your full ability. I could see it in the way you moved, the way you handled him at the end. You were still restraining yourself." Ethan sat across from me, and for the first time since our wedding, he did not attempt to deflect the question. "Yes," he said simply. "I was." "Why?" I asked. "You could have ended that trial in a single movement, and instead you allowed him 4 separate attempts, made a public display of your patience before finally stopping him. Why show restraint in front of an audience that already believed you were weak?" "Because showing my full strength would have terrified this entire court far more than it needed to be terrified," Ethan said. "I needed Marcus Hale to understand he could not win, without needing every noble watching to believe I was some kind of threat to be destroyed, rather than a partner to be trusted. There is a difference, Leora, between proving a point and starting a war none of us actually want." I studied him carefully, beginning to understand something about the true nature of the restraint he had described to me weeks earlier. The same restraint that had apparently defined humanity's entire conduct throughout our war. "This is what you meant," I said slowly, "when you told me humanity held back during the war. This is exactly what that restraint looks like in practice." "Yes," Ethan confirmed. "Total strength without control accomplishes nothing lasting. It only creates new enemies out of old ones, and ensures the next war begins the moment the current one ends. Real strength, Leora, is knowing exactly how much force is required, and using no more than that." I sat with his words for a long moment, feeling something shift within me, some fundamental piece of my understanding of power itself rearranging into a new and unfamiliar shape. Every lesson I had absorbed since childhood had taught me that strength meant domination, that a true ruler crushed every challenge decisively and without hesitation, lest any hint of restraint be mistaken for weakness by rivals eager to exploit it. Ethan had just demonstrated something entirely different in front of my entire court, and somehow, impossibly, it had left a deeper impression than total domination ever could have. "Cesareth will not accept this quietly," I said finally. "She has staked her entire challenge on proving you unworthy, and instead, the whole empire watched you show mercy to her own champion. She will find some new angle to attack from. She always does." "I know," Ethan said, "which is why we need to discuss what comes next, before she has the chance to act first." Over the following days, reports reached me from across the empire, describing the same reaction repeating itself, in court after court, hive after hive. Nobles who had dismissed my marriage as a humiliating political necessity now spoke of Ethan with genuine curiosity, some even with quiet respect. Soldiers who had privately mocked the idea of a human consort now requested transfers to serve in his personal guard, eager to learn from whatever discipline had produced the calm, controlled power the entire arena had witnessed. Asoreth, predictably, did not accept defeat gracefully. Within a week, she had convened a private council of her own supporters, quietly gathering support among the handful of noble houses still resentful of the treaty's terms, arguing that a human who could defeat a trial champion so effortlessly represented not proof of peace, but proof of exactly the danger she had warned against from the very beginning. "If this human could defeat our finest warrior without effort," she argued, according to reports that reached me from sympathetic nobles within her own council, then humanity was never truly defeated during the war at all. We were shown mercy, and mercy from an enemy who could have destroyed us is not peace. It is a leash, waiting to be pulled tight the moment it suits them. I could not entirely dismiss her argument, unsettling as it was. She was, in her own twisted way, arriving at the same truth Ethan had shared with me weeks earlier on that quiet balcony overlooking my palace gardens. The question was not whether her fear held some validity. The question was, what to do with an empire now forced to confront that truth in the open, rather than continuing to hide behind comfortable lies about a war we had genuinely believed we nearly won. I brought the matter directly to Ethan, laying out Sareth's growing faction and the dangerous rhetoric spreading quietly through certain corners of my court. "She is not entirely wrong," I admitted, watching his face carefully for any reaction. "Humanity could have destroyed us during the war. You have as much as confirmed this yourself. Why should my people trust a peace built upon a strength you deliberately concealed from us?" Ethan considered the question seriously, without any hint of the easy deflection he had once used so effortlessly during our earliest days together. "Because concealed strength used to build peace is entirely different from concealed strength used to build control," he said finally. "Humanity did not hide our full capability from your empire in order to manipulate you later, Leora. We hid it because revealing it immediately after a devastating war would have crushed any hope of genuine peace, replacing it instead with fear, resentment, and an inevitable desire for revenge the moment your empire rebuilt enough strength to attempt it." "And now that Sareth has forced the truth into the open regardless?" I asked. "Now we have a choice," Ethan said. "We can allow fear to define what your empire believes about humanity going forward, or we can offer something else instead. Understanding, partnership, proof that restraint was never weakness and never manipulation, but simply the wisdom to know that lasting peace requires more patience than total victory ever could. I understood, in that moment, precisely what he was suggesting, and precisely how dangerous such a path could prove if handled incorrectly. You want to address the full council directly, I said. Not simply defend yourself against Sereth's accusations, but explain the truth to every noble in this empire, openly and without concealment. Yes, Ethan confirmed. That is an enormous risk, I said. Once the full truth is spoken aloud, in front of every hive represented in my court, it cannot be quietly withdrawn again. Sereth's faction will use it as proof of exactly the danger they have been warning against. Others may see it as an admission that our entire war, and every death within it, meant far less than we were led to believe. I know, Ethan said quietly, but hiding it further only delays a confrontation that will happen eventually regardless, likely at a moment far less controlled than the one we could choose to create ourselves. I sat with the weight of his proposal for the remainder of that evening, weighing the political dangers against the quiet certainty I had come to recognize in him since the moment he first stopped an assassin's blade on our wedding day. Every instinct trained into me since childhood warned against voluntarily revealing weakness, or in this case, revealing a truth that could easily be twisted to resemble weakness in the mouths of rivals like Sereth. And yet I found myself, against every lesson I had ever been taught about the nature of power, agreeing with him. Full council, I said finally. Every hive represented, Sereth included. If we are going to do this, we do it completely, with nothing held back to be discovered later and used against us. Ethan nodded, quiet satisfaction crossing his expression for the first time since the trial had ended. Then let us make certain, Leora, that when the truth is finally spoken, your empire understands exactly what kind of peace it has actually been offered. 3 days later, I called for a full assembly of the council, every noble house from every allied hive summoned to hear an address that would either secure the fragile peace my empire had fought so desperately to win, or shatter it completely in front of witnesses who would carry the story back to every corner of Thracian space. I did not know, as I took my seat that morning beside my husband, exactly how the assembled court would receive what he was about to reveal. I knew only that whatever followed would define the remainder of my reign, and quite possibly the future of both our species for generations to come. The council chamber had never held so many representatives at once. Delegations from every allied hive crowded into seats normally reserved for far smaller gatherings, all of them summoned on short notice for an address they had been told would settle, once and for all, the questions raised by Sereth's failed challenge. I sat upon my throne with Ethan standing quietly beside me, and Sereth seated prominently among the visiting dignitaries, her expression carefully neutral, though I recognized the sharp calculation behind her eyes, already searching for whatever advantage she might extract from whatever was about to be revealed. 3 months ago, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber. I married a human, as part of the treaty that ended our war with Earth. Since that day, questions have circulated throughout this court regarding my husband's true nature, questions that culminated in a formal trial demanded by Queen Sereth and answered in a manner none of us fully anticipated. I paused, looking out across the assembled nobles, many of whom had traveled great distances specifically to hear what followed. I have asked my husband to address this council directly and to answer honestly whatever questions remain. I believe, after everything I have personally witnessed since our marriage began, that this empire deserves the complete truth, however uncomfortable that truth may prove to be. Ethan stepped forward, and the entire chamber fell into absolute silence, every eye fixed upon him. 6 years ago, he began, his voice calm and steady, carrying easily through the vast stone chamber. Your empire went to war with Earth, believing you faced the full might of humanity. You did not. What you faced during that war was a fraction of what humanity could have brought against you, restrained deliberately, in the hope that the conflict could end before either side lost the ability to build genuine peace afterward. A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the chamber, though Ethan continued without pause. I understand what this truth suggests to many of you, that you were shown mercy rather than defeated fairly, that the peace you now stand within was granted rather than earned. I understand why this feels like weakness disguised as generosity, and I understand why some among you, Queen Sereth included, have interpreted it as proof that humanity cannot be trusted, that restraint shown once can simply be withdrawn whenever it suits us. Sereth rose from her seat, seizing the opening he had offered. "You have just confirmed everything I warned this council against," she said, her voice sharp with vindication. "A species capable of destroying us, choosing instead to hold that strength in reserve, married quietly into our own throne. This is not peace. This is patience, waiting for the moment your empire decides restraint no longer serves its interests." "You are not wrong to fear that possibility," Ethan replied, his calm unshaken by her accusation. "Any strength held in reserve carries that risk, regardless of intention. But consider this, Queen Sereth. If humanity truly wished to conquer your empire, there was no need for restraint at all, no need for a treaty, no need for a marriage binding our two peoples together through years of shared governance and slowly building trust. Conquest requires none of these things. Conquest requires only strength, applied without hesitation. We did not choose that path when it was available to us, and we do not intend to choose it now, when far less justification exists for such an act." "Then why show restraint at all?" Sereth pressed, "if not to lull us into false security. Because total victory, achieved through total destruction, only creates an enemy who spends the following century planning revenge," Ethan said. "Your empire lost the war, Queen Sereth, in every practical sense. Humanity chose not to make that loss absolute, because an absolute loss breeds an absolute desire for retribution, and we have no interest in fighting this same war again in 20 years, or 50, or 100. We would rather spend those years building something neither side needs to fight for at all." The chamber remained silent for a long moment, the weight of his words settling over every noble present. I watched carefully as expressions shifted throughout the crowd, some hardening with the same suspicion Sereth had voiced, others softening with a dawning understanding I recognized clearly, having experienced that same shift myself weeks earlier on a quiet moonlit balcony. "You ask this council to trust an act of mercy we did not request and cannot verify," Sereth said finally, though some of the earlier conviction had drained from her voice. "How does any ruler here confirm that what you describe as restraint was not simply calculated strategy, designed to appear generous while accomplishing exactly the same result as conquest, at a fraction of the cost?" "You cannot fully confirm it," Ethan admitted. "Trust of this kind is never proven through words alone, Queen Sereth. It is proven through years of consistent action, through choices made when no one is watching, through restraint maintained even when circumstances would easily justify abandoning it. I understand this council cannot simply take my word today and consider the matter settled. I am not asking you to. I am asking you to watch, over the years ahead, whether the peace offered to you continues to hold, whether the restraint shown during our war continues to define our conduct now that the war has ended." I rose from my throne then, feeling the moment demanded my voice alongside his. I stood beside this man during a trial, meant to prove him unworthy of my throne, I said, addressing the full assembly directly. I watched him restrain himself against an opponent he could have defeated in a single movement, choosing instead to demonstrate mercy in front of an audience that expected only violence. I have watched him treat every servant in my palace with the same respect he shows visiting nobility. I have watched him defend my life without hesitation, and defend the dignity of his defeated opponent with equal care immediately afterward. Whatever restraint humanity showed during our war, I have witnessed that same restraint continue, consistently, every single day since this marriage began. Sereth studied me for a long moment, something calculating still visible behind her eyes, though the sharp edge of her earlier hostility had noticeably dulled. Fine words, Leora, she said finally, from a queen who has clearly grown fond of the husband forced upon her. But fine words are not proof, and this council requires more than sentiment before it grants its trust so easily. Then let us offer more than words, Ethan said. Let this treaty include provisions allowing regular inspection of humanity's true capabilities, verified by neutral observers from every hive represented in this chamber, ensuring transparency going forward that was admittedly absent during the war's conclusion. Let humanity's restraint be something your empire can measure and verify, rather than something you are simply asked to accept on faith alone. A murmur of surprised approval spread through the chamber at this offer, several nobles exchanging quiet nods of consideration. Even Sereth appeared momentarily caught off guard by the proposal, clearly having expected either denial or evasion, rather than an offer of increased transparency. You would allow such inspection, she said slowly, knowing it exposes exactly the strength you claim to be restraining. I would allow it, Ethan confirmed, because a peace that cannot withstand honest examination was never truly stable to begin with. Your empire deserves better than a treaty built on hidden truths, Queen Cesareth. So does mine. The council session that followed stretched long into the evening, nobles debating the terms of this new transparency provision, questioning Ethan directly about the nature of humanity's capabilities, questioning me about my own experiences since the marriage began. By the time the session finally concluded, no complete resolution had been reached, though something fundamental had shifted throughout the chamber, a cautious willingness to consider trust where suspicion had reigned only hours earlier. Sereth approached me privately as the council dispersed, her expression unreadable in the fading evening light. I still do not fully trust this peace, she admitted quietly, but I confess, Leora, I did not expect a human to answer my challenge with an offer of greater vulnerability rather than greater concealment. That was not the response of a species planning conquest. No, I agreed. It was not. In the weeks that followed, the transparency provisions Ethan had proposed were formally added to our treaty, and neutral observers began the slow, careful process of verifying humanity's true capabilities against the restraint they claimed to exercise. I do not know, even now, whether every noble in my court has come to fully trust the peace we share with Earth. Trust of this depth is rarely built quickly, and Sereth's faction, though weakened, has not entirely disappeared. But I know this: the empire that once mocked my marriage as a humiliating political necessity now speaks of my husband with quiet respect, sometimes even genuine admiration. Soldiers who once considered him decorative now study his restraint as a discipline worth learning, and I, who once stood ready to ignore the human forced upon me as nothing more than a diplomatic formality, found instead a partner whose quiet strength reshaped my entire understanding of what true power actually requires. Standing beside Ethan on our palace balcony one final evening, watching the twin moons rise over gardens that had witnessed so much change since our wedding day, I finally understood the full weight of what this marriage had truly given my empire. Not a husband to be tolerated, not a treaty to be endured, but proof, hard-won and carefully verified, that the strongest power any being can hold is the power to restrain itself, again and again, for the sake of a peace worth protecting. I had misjudged him from the very first day we met, dismissing him as weak, simply because he chose not to display the strength he actually carried. I would not make that mistake again. And as I looked out over an empire slowly learning to trust the same lesson I had already learned myself, I felt something I had not expected to feel toward the marriage forced upon me by treaty. I felt grateful that the man I had once dismissed so easily had chosen again and again to be my husband, and not my enemy.